Bom dia, pessoal. Boa tarde, na verdade.
Good morning, good afternoon. We'll start in a few minutes. We'll start our panel in a few minutes. I think you saw that there's an explanation in our chat box. We are going to have 3 speakers. First, from Professor Valeria Arza and Professor Muki, they will speak English and we will have simultaneous translation into Portuguese. You just click on the globe on your bottom bar and you choose your language of preference.
Tem uma opção que é globozinho de interpretação.
So in your globe, you have the interpretation button. You click there and you have 3 options. The option for the original audio, the first one, you are going to hear the original sound from the floor. The second option is for those who speak English and wish to hear translation into English. And the third option is for Portuguese speakers, most of us, that want to hear a simultaneous translation from English to Portuguese. Everything that is said in English, you will be able to hear in Portuguese. If you choose Portuguese, you will have also the possibility to mute the original audio. Otherwise, you will hear just the original speaker on the background and the translation above. So there are 2 options. You can mute the original audio completely, or you can hear the speaker on the background, okay? So if you have any questions, you can ask through the chat.
Então, acho que nós podemos dar início.
So without further ado, I think we can start. Natalia, do you agree? Can we start? Yes, okay, we can go on. So everyone, good afternoon. My name is Sarita Albagli. I am a researcher with the Brazilian Institute of Information and Science and Technology, IBICT. I am a professor in the graduate program in information science developed by IBICT together with the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And I also coordinate Cidadã, the open science, open and citizen science innovation. I am speaking a little bit slowly, she said, to make translation easier. The objective of this panel is to introduce an overview of different visions and questions on policies for citizen science. This is one of the sensitive axes of our area of study from the point of view of Latin American and European contexts. Of course, being aware that both Latin America and Europe have a huge diversity of different situations. And our idea is by no means trying to homogenize the issue, but much to the contrary, to bring different points from these 2 regions. This panel is also part of the activities developed by the working group from which I'm a part of, that is the mark number 5 of citizen science in the open government partnership. So yesterday we had an activity which was a workshop to discuss our work. Now we have this panel, and after we are going to have an activity in the month of August, where we are going to announce very soon, where we will invite the different funding agencies in Brazil to discuss the topic. But this, I'm going to explain more in my talk. In this panel, we have the presence, and I thank in advance the speakers, Professor Valeria Arza, who's a senior researcher in science, technology, innovation policies from the National Council of Research in Argentina, the CONICET, Argentina. That is a very similar to our CNPq, also associate researcher of the Center of Transformation, CENIT, from the University of San Martin, and then Valeria will tell us more about this. And she's also a professor in the University of Buenos Aires. Valeria has been working with policies on science and technology, specifically in open and citizen science. And she's coordinating 2 projects, maybe others, but from what I know too, that are very much related to our topic in focus stream, how science, research, innovation can contribute to the sustainable development objectives in developing countries, and quartz, co-designing social citizen science for collective actions on environmental justice in the area of Riachuelo. I think she's going to tell us more about this. Also, we have Professor Muki Haklay. I'm sorry if I missed the pronunciation, from University College London in the UK. He is professor of geographic information science in the Department of Geography of University College London, co-director of the Extreme Citizen Science Group. This is a very interesting concept for us. He has been working on public access, the use and creation of environmental information, participative mapping, and citizen science. Muki has an active participation in subsidizing the design of citizen science in Europe, and has been an active participant in the European Association of Citizen Science and the project. There is also a platform of European citizen science. So we are going to have 30 minutes of for each speaker, and in the end, we will open for questions and for our debate. And please, if you have any questions, you can write them in the chat box. They will be answered in the end of our session. For those who are a little bit late, we have simultaneous translation. You just press the button. I thank also Valeria for speaking English, because then we have only two languages being translated, Portuguese and English. So Valeria, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm going to talk about what is there in the title, Citizen Science, Practices, Challenges and Policies, providing some insights from Argentina. I wanted to tell you that this presentation draws a lot from one of the research projects that Sarita just mentioned, that is COAT, and in particularly on work in progress I'm doing with Guillermina Actis. The organization of the presentation is in 6 blocks. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about COAT, this project. I will very briefly talk about the potential of citizen science for transformation, but I want to focus on the challenges of citizen science. The challenges to carry out citizen science initiatives, and in particularly to carry out the connection between citizen science initiatives and policies. Then I'm going to briefly mention some policies to promote citizen science in the region, and some broad guidelines for policy action based on the challenges that I presented previously. So first of all, what is COAT? The name is Co-Designing Citizen Social Science for Collective Action. And if we think about the definition, the traditional definition of citizen science by Irving and Bonney, we can say that there are some dimensions, social dimension, that is normally missing in the definition of citizen science, or underexplored, the social dimension of citizen science. So in COAT, what we want to do is actually to do some experiences in citizen, or what we call citizen social science. So we are designing different initiatives that we call research and innovation actions that try to address some social concerns. And we are working in 6 different locations on 4 different issues: mental health, youth, employment, environmental justice, and gender equality. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about environmental out in Buenos Aires in Argentina. This action is based on the Matanza-Riachuelo Basin, which is in the southern edge of Buenos Aires city in Argentina. And this area is highly contaminated, and people that live there are 6 million people more or less living there, are affected by high levels of social vulnerability and also by top-down policies regarding the sanitation of the basin. So what we plan, and what we try to do in COAC, in this Research and Innovation Action that started in 2020, is to promote the use of citizen science tools to create new knowledge that could be useful for environmental justice. And what we've done is during 2020 and 2021, we have organized several activities to co-design a citizen-generated data platform that is called ¿Qué pasa Riachuelo?, which in English means What's up Riachuelo, that's the name of the river, that collects data on different social environmental issues that are important for environmental justice. The platform is now just in the beta version, and we are starting the implementation and this dissemination of the platform. So if we think about the potential of citizen science and citizen social science in particular for transformation, let me just tell you a bit before about the definition of what we mean by citizen social science. So citizen science, we know, is it means the co-production and the participation in the production of knowledge based on the experiences of the communities that participate. As Muki and others have said in different papers, citizen science is a big umbrella that covers a very different type of experiences based on the public participation in the production of scientific knowledge, right? But when we talked about citizen social science, we need to take into consideration that these people, these participants that are involved in the citizen science initiative are politically mobilized to solve and to create solutions or transformative actions to some social problems that affect them. So citizen social science initiatives must be very much integrated into community networks. We work with community organizations, and we try to build from collective knowledge that has been produced by these communities already in the territory. And the problems are very much situated and are very much related to issues that these people have experienced, first-hand experience on. So citizen social science could be graphed as in this triangle, is mixing somehow, is integrating methods and practices from social sciences, citizen science, and also activism. Just very briefly, because I'm talking from Argentina, just to let you know that there are many experiences, citizen science experiences on environmental issues in Argentina that have been mapped recently by UNDP and also the Ministry of Science in Argentina. They mapped around 30 projects on citizen science for environment. And in this project, there are around more than 15,000 participants, and some of them are very large. There are 30% of the projects involve more than 1,000.
Well, Valeria has told us that she was facing some internet problems, and if there was any problems, she would ask Professor Haklay to substitute her, and then she will try to reconnect and do the presentation. So we will have this change in our agenda. Is it okay for you, Professor Haklay?
Yes, it is okay. I'm happy to start. So should I share the screen?
Okay, please.
So in the next 30 minutes, I suggest that I'll cover policies for citizen science, and I will talk from a European perspective, but also beyond that perspective. So I'll start with the interesting fact about the definition of citizen science. So this is a possible definition of citizen science within the open science policy, describing it in a wide way. So notice that it's talking about voluntary participation of non-professional scientists in research and innovation at different stages of the process and at different level of engagement, from shaping the research agenda and policy to gathering, processing, and analyzing data and assessing the outcome of research. Now, this is coming, as you can see on the side, from a document that is produced by the European Commission as part of its big research and innovation program, Horizon Europe. And we have even the commissioner appearing on the brochure, demonstrating the significance of it. And it's something to think about. How did we got into the point that we have this type of things within a 90 billion euros program? And if we roll back 15 years, we can see maybe the start of it. So when Jackie McGlade, who is now at UCL, but then was the head of the European Environment Agency, during a conference in 2008, which was following the Ohus Convention, I'll talk about it later, and she was already talking about that often the best information comes from those who are closest to it, and it's important to harness this local knowledge if we want to tackle climate change adequately. And shortly after this conference, and during as a demonstration of the principle, the European Environment Agency, which is a policy body linked to the European Commission, shared this application, produced in collaboration with Microsoft and Esri, a GIS company, where citizens could already start reporting about their information and their perception about the quality of the water. And considering that that was 15 years ago, already we are seeing experiments in citizen science within the policy area. So actually, within those two slides, we have seen two things. We have seen citizen science for policy. So how citizen science can be providing information that is used within policy, as in the example of the European Environment Agency. And we've seen in the first slide, policies for citizen science. And we'll cover those two topics. I'll kind of give you a way to think about the different ways in which policy can work at different scales and contexts. And then in the policy, we will also talk at policy from the very global level all the way to the local level. So let's start with citizen science for policy. So one way in which you can understand it, and that's, you see here, a diagram from the work of Susanne Hecker, who is now the vice chair of the European Citizen Science Association. And she's pointing that we can actually see, based on previous work, pointing out that we can see the policy cycle as a process that involves agenda setting, then the policy formulation, followed by policy decision-making, then the policy implementation and the policy evaluation. And in each one of these, there is a role for citizen science in terms of production of the data and the use of it. And if we want to look in slightly more detail, and as a geographer, I would look at geography, what else? And therefore, I would look at different level at how policy is actually playing out at this level and how citizen science is playing a part of it. So we look at hyperlocal, basically a neighborhood, the municipal, the city, the region, the national, and the continental. And we'll see how different issues are being addressed. Different policy area will cover that. And we'll see also different activity types, passive sensing, when you just put something on the phone and let it do the work, and there is the volunteering in sharing data and involving in it, to volunteer thinking when you classify information, to actually taking observation or participating in observation. At the neighborhood level, a lot of time, the issue that will involve citizen science will be something around environmental management, concerned in the neighborhood about, say, a new road that is being built. This is an example from Jerusalem that you see over here. Or it can be about noise, or it can be about other types of pollution. So it's an issue that actually exercises the local community, and they want to address it through data collection and using it. So in this case, you see the community concerned about the road that is being built in the area, and they're using kite mapping that was developed by Public Laboratory of Open Science and Technology to allow them to map the area and then make the case to the authority based on evidence. And similar things can be done in noise and other things. At this level, a lot of things are happening, at ad hoc. You don't need organization. Few activists are getting together and then doing the work and designing things. At the city level, once we move into the city level, there is kind of different issues about why the city will organize a citizen science activity. So that can involve issues around, say, smart cities. So an old example from Boston, where they wanted to put a citizen to download an app that will sense when there is a bump in the road, and that might help in managing the road and identifying potholes. And it can involve different types of environmental citizen science that can work. In the city scale, there is all kind of benefits of having the municipality, of having organizations that work across the city, and the scale of it is still quite small, that it's possible to organize activity quite easily. At the regional level, it's usually an area where the governance aspect of it is usually weak. There isn't robust governmental structure that can support this thing. But then you can have specific projects. So one interesting areas where you do see regional activity is either environmental management or public health, dealing with disease and similar things. And one example from Germany, the Muki Atlas, of people recording information about mosquitoes and then sharing the information and allowing to deal both with the ecological observation but also with the health impact, is an example of this activity. But that is something that it's lack the proper organizational structure, because again, at the regional level, you won't usually find environmental organization or NGO that operate at this level. And it will require, say in this case, university professors who are interested in the topic. The country scale, just like with the city scale, is another scale where we have strong government and national institution. So here's an example from France, from the Museum of Natural History in Paris, but it's also a national museum, and they can create projects that are covering the whole nation. So in this case, recording wildflowers in the street in different areas, and that involves a large range of issues and a lot of examples of activities that can happen within the citizen science. And finally, when we're talking about continental, again, now we are in the area of intergovernmental interaction, and that's traditionally a very weak area, and it's very difficult to organize activity at this level. Even in cases of Europe, where we have the European Union, which is relatively stronger in terms of its ability to coordinate things, there is still budget limitation and also what's called the subsidiarity principle, where the union is not allowed to intervene with the issues that are happening in each member state. So in those cases, when you can find projects that are happening at continental scale, they will happen only when there is, say, a scientific project. So this is an example of a project that was done again many years ago around the anniversary of Darwin, and then analyzing observations about different snails across Europe. But that's require, as you can see, a lot of translation in different languages and the engagement of scientists and people with interest from each of these places. So what you can see is that at different scale, local, city, regional, and country, you're actually getting different modes of participation, because at the very local scale, people can engage in the neighborhood. They get engaged very much. But as the geographical scale increase, the role of the individual participant in the whole process is diminishing, and it usually require more like crowdsourcing type activity because of the issues of language and other issues. There is also especially activity that are happening, interestingly, at those different levels. So at the neighborhood level, when it's completely ad hoc, it can work well, but for a specific period and for a specific issue. The city and the national level, we have organizational structure and transport network and all kinds of things that work for us. And as you are going up in scaling, you also need to think about how technology is playing an important part in it. And we can find many policy fields where citizen science is effective. And we can see even citizen science now being integrated into monitoring the sustainable development goals. So in environmental management, monitoring water quality or biodiversity, in education, promoting science, technology, engineering, and mathematics education. We can see it in science teaching. We see museums and culture institutions using it for deeper engagement of participants, health and medicine, and so on. So in many policy areas, we find these things. And it's not surprising that the European Union, because of its interest in citizen science, is now monitoring it. So the body of the European Union that is doing the science for it, the Joint Research Center, is creating different reports and monitoring the development of citizen science in the policy area. And you can find, for example, a database of 500 projects that are contributing to policy on the website. And those are just few examples of the reports. But if you look for JRC and policy and citizen science, you will find all these reports. So we looked at citizen science for policy. Let's look the other way around. What are the policies for citizen science? So here's where the policies for citizen science, just like with the citizen science for policy, creating issue for us, because each citizen science, and those of us who are involved in the field are familiar with it, is actually balancing between multiple goals and scales and depth of engagement that we need to do. We are trying to do really great science, but we also want a really enjoyable and engaging experience. Sometimes we want to engage with marginalized groups and then invest a lot of resources in that. Or we want to have good coverage of large area, like your country, or like many other cases where we want a good coverage, or we want to raise awareness. Now, we can't do all the things all the time, and we need to kind of a balance between those different goals. And that's also mean that in terms of the policy, we need to think which of those we want to support with which policy. And the role of policy in citizen science is therefore, it needs different things. It needs things like legitimacy and acceptance as an effective methodology within scientific practice and in the use of scientific information. And we're all familiar with the claims that citizen science have a problem with data quality. And that's actually something that means that we need to convince scientists, and we also need to convince policymakers or people in national statistical offices that they can use the information. We need also to think about the science policy and where the budgets are being shared because we need to support project personnel, equipment, and digital and physical infrastructure that will support it. So a website, for example, that will record the biodiversity of a country is something that we need. And we also need to support for a national coordination effort across project and sharing the best practice and new innovation. So those are kind of the main area where we're finding policy in support of citizen science. And we see it at different levels. We see, for example, in the US, already in 2016, there was a law that was passed called the Citizen Science and Crowdsourcing Act. That was done specifically to allow the federal government to use citizen science because of all kind of limitation that would stop it. Or in the European Union, just before they launched this large 90 billion euros program, Horizon Europe, they kind of had a preliminary policy report on the science policy called LabFab App that was talking about citizen science as a major thing. And that led to what we will see next. So a good place that we'll start with to see the different policy, one example is the UNESCO recommendation on open science, where, by the way, there is plenty of space to join in and join the groups within citizen science that are contributing to it. When UNESCO created the approach for it, and open science is something that is aimed at higher education, research institution, but also on wider education, they specifically created in this area a whole aspect about alternative types of knowledge. So things like, for example, indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge, but they also include, and as you can see there on the left side, citizen science as a part of it. So this, for example, enable different countries or the practitioner in different countries to take those recommendations and talk with their government about how this thing should play out in the way that it will work. And right now, there is a process that recording what should happen and in which way UNESCO should monitor and encourage member states to move forward with this agenda. Another example, and I mentioned it before, is the Ohus Convention. This is a convention that was signed in 1998 in Europe, and it's the convention about public access to environmental information, participation in decision-making, and access to justice. So it's really important, and it's emerging from something called Principle 10 of the Rio Conference from 1992. By the way, just 3 years ago, the Escazú Agreement is doing something similar to Ohus just for the Latin America and for your area too, so it might be relevant. Now, this is actually about environmental law and about the ability of activists and environmental defenders to approach the government and get data. One part of it is the right to access information, and one element that was written in 1998 was talking about that information will be progressively become available in electronic databases and are easily accessible to the public through public telecommunication network. And the recommendation on how to implement this element of the convention is existing within the recommendation on electronic information tool. It's originally adopted in 2005, but it was updated in 2021 and now includes citizen science as a source of information that can be used for environmental management. And that's, again, another tool, another area of policy, this time in the environmental law and practice that supports citizen science. Another area, going back to Horizon Europe, is that you can see that the program itself, now after we actually have the program and you look at the text of it, is talking about creating responsible research and innovation content. A co-creation and co-design should be a program principle. And what is interesting about this text, and I won't go through every word of it, is that in Europe, Horizon Europe, which is starting now and will continue for 5-6 years, is actually based on legislation. And that means that throughout these six years, co-design and co-creation are fundamental parts of it. And therefore, we're going to see within Horizon Europe, open science as a principle, also the co-creation and co-design. So different forms of citizen science are basic things that should appear in every project. And that's how projects are evaluated. And as a result of it, people in the field are already reporting that different researchers are reaching out to them and asking them to join projects in order to contribute through citizen science. And in a way to support it, that's another kind of more bottom-up, but with some help from the top. We at the European Citizen Science Association created a document that will help to put content to what we mean by citizen science and what should be the things the different programs are taking in. So we created a document that was in response to some requests from the Commission that would define or help to define what kind of activities should be considered as citizen science. It's an open document and you can find it online, but that's a policy support document. So the community is supporting the top-down interest in citizen science and providing tools for it to help to do the right things. And this document is also referring, of course, to the famous EXA 10 principle of citizen science, which is another important policy document. But interestingly, the 10 principle were not enough for policymakers, and they asked for a more detailed document, which is this, what we provide. Now we can go a layer beneath that. Organizations can have their own policy. So for example, the League of European Research University, which is a voluntary project activity between different universities and other universities association in Europe, are creating recommendation on what to do and how to implement citizen science within their organization. So a report from 2016 that it's now implemented in different universities say that there should be a single point of contact, there should be ethical and logistical support, and we're actually seeing that in the creation of offices of citizen science in different universities. But they also talk about advocacy towards research funders and influence their approach and including it in their success criteria. Another project that it's very relevant and you might find it interesting is called Time for CS, or Time for Citizen Science, where we look at different institutions and their transformation to support citizen science. And we both done a study about the institutional transformation, and you can actually see how different research performing organizations are starting from different activities of citizen science in different disciplines. Then it can evolve to different champions, people in the organization who are doing that, but then also access to national and international funding and maybe participation in network. But when we're seeing institutional policies that include public engagement and citizen science, or when we see that they actually appointed funded coordinators, we're actually seeing the organization starting to have internal policy in support of citizen science. Another thing that might interest you in terms of the policy, and that's the last thing that I'm going to mention today, is that at the moment, the European Commission, is running a mutual learning exercise. As you can see, 11 countries in Europe, Norway, Austria, Belgium, France, Germany, Hungary, Italy, Portugal, Romania, Slovenia, and Sweden came together and they want to share information about the different activities and how their Ministry of Science and their research funding bodies can share and support citizen science. So we cover the overview of citizen science. We talked about good practices, and we currently talking about excellence and improving the activities in that. You can see the timeline, and all the information and all the reports that coming out of it are available on this website for free. And you reach out to them, and also the expert in the project can be reached out and involved in it in different ways. So there is all sorts of activities in the area of policy. So the kind of things that I'll finish with is notice how many concepts of policy we were talking about, from something about dealing with a nuisance in your neighborhood all the way to UNESCO and policy about open science. And what do we mean by that in different areas? Also, the potential of citizen science for policy, with plenty of potential and opportunities, but also the policy for citizen science. And notice how I follow through examples from education, from environment, from research and innovation, and from local policies. And actually, we need those mixes to do them, and the impact of it will come in many different ways. So I hope that this was a useful introduction to policy and citizen science, and I'm looking forward to our discussion, and I'm delighted that Valeria is back and we can continue with her presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Muki. Muito obrigada. Com certeza no chat aqui já várias manifestações.
Thank you. We see different already people in the chat asking for more materials. It's an excellent starting point. Valeria is back with us. This was already organized. If there were any technical problem, Muki would then start his presentation, and now we go back to Professor Valeria Arza.
I'm sorry, I hope it's going to work better now. I'm going to continue from what had just Muki said. I mean, this idea of citizen science can have a potential for policy, right? So I'm going to start from that. I'm going to just skip some of the slides I was presenting just to save some time. And so when we think about the potential of citizen science for policy, we can think about two main, type of potential. One, it is the most mentioned in the literature that has to do with the instrumental potential that citizen science has on public policy in relation to the amount and originality of information and knowledge that citizen science is capable to produce. We know that citizen science is capable to produce a large amount of data that sometimes is geo-referenced and reaches remote territories that are very difficult to reach otherwise. The time dimension also matters because it can be continuously updated and can serve to some early warnings. And also the thematic subject that is related to the potential that citizen science has in identifying certain themes that may not be so visible for policymakers. But besides this instrumental dimension of the contribution of citizen science on policymaking, we have this other dimension that I think is particularly important in situations where there are conflicts of interest, as there is always the case, or sometimes the case in environmental policy. When we think about a community that is highly mobilized to generate new knowledge about something that is known or unknown, we might also think about what that means in terms of the potential for political transformation, right? So some political actors, particularly those that want to challenge the status quo, that want to change the situation, might feel attracted to this initiative, to these citizen science initiatives, because they could mobilize the communities and could generate new data that could make a political change, or they could drive towards transformation. So I have an example here from Argentina that is people from the municipality, policymakers at local level, suspected that it was necessary to create some regulations to stop spraying pesticides in the surroundings of schools or in the surroundings of towns. And they relied on data created by some kind of citizen science initiatives that were the sanitary camps, and they supported the creation of these initiatives and the spread of this initiative in different towns. This initiative was promoted by one university, the public university, the University of Rosario in Argentina. As part of the medical curriculum, they were producing epidemiological data, and they have the support of some policymakers that want to change regulation. So citizen science, we believe, is also a political tool for transformation. But let's talk a little bit about the challenges facing citizen science initiatives. So I'm going to organize them in 3 different blocks, right? Challenges related to participation, challenges related to the data that is produced in citizen science initiatives, and challenges related to the tensions that exist with traditional ways of doing scientific research. So if we think about the first block, participation, there is always challenges about how to motivate participation, how to guarantee that the people that should be producing knowledge and should be sharing the experiences of social relevant problems are actually motivated to participate. And this is something that is particularly complicated when we talked about participants that are affected by social vulnerability, which characterizes many of the social environmental problems that we are interested in. So these people face urgent emergencies that they need to attend every day. And for them, it may be a bit complicated to commit to continuous participation in citizen science initiatives. So motivation is an important aspect to take into consideration. Then we have all the ethical aspects regarding participation that range from unpaid work by volunteers, how to handle data that is sensitive, intellectual property regarding the results, how to manage expectation. And this is particularly complex when we are talking about issues or themes where there are conflict of interest. Then we have the challenges of how to guarantee that people that want to really commit to the project or to the initiative have the resources to do so, have the opportunity to do so, how to guarantee equal opportunities for everyone that must be there producing knowledge for a specific theme to actually be there. And then in relation to data, well, Muki have mentioned some of them. There are some issues related, challenges related to what is considered valid data. So to what extent it represents the problem it wants to address, because this relies on volunteer participation. So we cannot rely on social science methods like sampling. Or there is also this issue of whether the data is properly reliable, because also the people that participate may be subject to some objectivity biases. And I want to raise these issues of the validity of the information because of the frustrations that came up when this data is not used for not being considered valid. So if the data that is produced with a lot of efforts by many participants is not used for the transformative action that is meant to be used, then it creates frustration, and it also creates more problems in terms of participation, right? So how to guarantee that these people continue to be motivated to participate if the data they produce is not properly used. And then we have the tension with the traditional scientific institutions that we all know, that is related, in particular, I think that one of the most important one is related to skills that academic researchers have in order to be doing this kind of work that needs to manage participation from many different people from many different backgrounds, right? And also, of course, the challenges that we all researchers face in terms of the incentive schemes that not necessarily well regard these kind of efforts that we need to do in order to be involved in citizen science initiatives. So, but now I want to say something about the challenge that is related to the connection, to the actual connection between citizen science for policy making, right? So what we are doing in COACT, and this is relying on the results I'm going to show you are very preliminary results of an exercise that we are doing as part of COACT, and in particularly with Guillermina Artis. What we are doing is trying to understand the perception of policymakers in the area of sanitation of the Matanza-Riachuelo Basin, their perceptions regarding the potential use of citizen data created through the Que Pasa Riachuelo platform that we have co-designed together with the community. So we want to identify how policymakers regard the knowledge that has been produced in our initiative, or is going to be produced basically through our initiative or through other citizen science initiatives. So what we want to do is to identify commonalities and disparities among the perceptions of policymakers in uptaking the knowledge that is produced through citizen science initiatives. So what we do is we are doing a Q methods exercise. And to do that Q methods exercise, we first did a literature review on this connection between citizen science and policymaking to identify key dimensions that characterize the connection between citizen science and public policy, right? And then we design a stratified sample of statements, narratives, sayings regarding that connection, the connection between citizen science and policymaking. And these statements are these little squares with text that you can see in the figure. There are 52 of them, like 52 narratives of how this connection works. And we ask policymakers to organize these statements in terms of their agreement. To what extent they totally disagree with those statements, so they are going to be located in this matrix that has a normal distribution way to the left when they totally disagree with the statements, or whether they totally agree to the statement and they're going to be placed in the far right part of the matrix, right? So what we then do is we do a statistical analysis to actually understand the common distribution of statements across different stakeholders, across different policymakers, and try to reach some conclusion on what are the different narratives of the relation between citizen science and policymakers, and how and when they are different. And so the dimensions that organize the different statements are three, right? And this comes from the literature, basically, literature connecting citizen science with policymaking. First of all, the type of influence. On what part of policymaking we expect citizen science to intervene, right? On the problem identification, on the implementation of policy measures, or on political change that create institutional change, program changes, or radically new practices in policymaking, right? Where we expect citizen science to have something to say or to have something to influence. Then the how, right? How is citizen science going to have that influence? Because of the data it produces, because of the participation of the community in the creation of that knowledge, or because of the participation of the community in the actual management of the policy measures that we are analyzing. And then the third dimension is related to the value. Do we value positively or negatively the connection between citizen science and policymaking? So we organized 52 statements. First we sampled the 52 statements based on this dimension. We want to have some statements that represent each of these connections that are there. And we ask policymakers to organize them in that matrix that has a normal distribution. Sorry. So what we have found is that in general, so far in the basin, those policymakers that have responsibility with the sanitation of the Riachuelo Basin, they have a generally positive perception of using citizen science data in policymaking, right? So we found, for instance, in the graph that you have there, as I told you, one of the dimensions to sample the statement was whether the relation was considered positive or negative, the relation between citizen science and policymaking. In the sample of statements, around 30% of the statements were negative. So they have a saying that was negative in relation to the use of citizen science knowledge in policymaking. But when we asked our participants to actually rank them, we found that those negative statements are normally placed in the left end, so they are badly regarded, they are badly perceived. The negative statements are statements with which the policymakers that we interviewed disagreed the most, right? So, and they tend to agree the most with the positive statements. So with that results, we can already say something about the perception that these people have, the people that we interview, have regarding the potential use of citizen science in policymaking, which is generally positive, right? And we also found a lot of agreement among the participants that we interviewed. Like 50% of the statements that came up were organized more or less in the same orders, right? And there you have two examples of statements that there was a lot of agreement. First, many people agreed and have positive perceptions regarding the statement that is in the left, right? That is a positive statement that says that citizen science has a lot of potential to identify key issues because the people that are exposed to problems are the ones who identify the problems. So a lot of people agree with that statement and was placed in the highly agree section of the matrix. And then there was a lot of agreement as well in terms of a negative statement that suggests that data produced by citizen science is not valid, where there were a lot of our interviewees that actually disagree with this negative statement. So it is also showing that there is a positive perception of the use of citizen science data in policymaking. And then we also found that citizen science, among the policymakers that we interviewed, they highly regard citizen science for policy governance, right? For having an opportunity for people that were participating in the creation of knowledge to also participate in the co-management of some of the measures that are related to these social, to measures to address these social environmental problems. And as is normally the case in the literature, there was also some doubts, let's call it like that, regarding the validity of the data for policy implementation. So this is just a brief summary of some work that is in a very preliminary stage that make us be a little bit optimistic about the use of citizen science in policymaking in the theme that we are working with, that is the sanitation of the Riachuelo Basin. But I want to talk now about the second issue, the policies for citizen science, right? And well, Muki has talked a lot, and we learned a lot about the different policies that are there in Europe, right? And there are in developed countries we can find different type of mechanism for promoting citizen science. We have the UNESCO recommendations, but in the region, as far as I found, there is very little, right? So only in Colombia we have some ministerial resolutions, so some measures coming from a Ministry of Science that actually try to bring science and society more closely. And in that particular public policy or that particular document, they talked about the co-production of knowledge and the production of the communities in defining the research agenda, right? But then besides Colombia, we have some scattered initiatives like in Argentina, for instance, we have now a national committee that is trying to advise the Ministry of Science in producing recommendations for promoting open and citizen science. So this is something that is going on right now. And then in Chile, there are many NGOs that are advocating citizen science. And in Brazil, well, we have the network that is organizing this workshop. And then there are also some education programs that promote citizen science as part of the activities carried out in schools. But that was very brief, because there are not much to say about the policies that are there now to promote citizen science. Although we have many some ideas of how to go forward, right? And in terms of policy for promoting citizen science that are mostly related to the challenges that I mentioned before, right? So in order to address these challenges related to participation, well, there is a very important need of having ethical committees in universities to promote fair participation by community, to recommend good practices regarding this, because there are not a lot of experiences on this. And of course, we need to have this support from the national university to have ethical committees for that. And then, for instance, to have to know how to design informed consent procedures and to know how to design them in a dynamic way so they can be adapted to the different situations, to support several outreach activities, right? Some that already exist, but to make them more visible, to support activities related to the communication of science, and in particularly to make citizen science projects more visible. This is important to improve their legitimacy, particularly regarding the data it produces. So we guarantee or we promote the use of data in different actions, including policy making, right? And then on data, well, to create more instances to experiment with citizen-driven data, right? There are not many opportunities for researchers to actually try to use the citizen data and see how it works to address some of the research questions that they may have. And of course, institutional support to apply open data policy. This is something very important because this has to do with training and with técnicas al pura, with infrastructure. Because, for instance, in Argentina, there is a law that we are obliged as researchers to publish the data openly, but there are not a lot of instances where researchers can actually learn of how to produce open data, how to create the right metadata, etc. And then also institutional support for the generation of the generation of data that is going to be valid. For instance, to digitally automatize the validation of data, or to create data that doesn't have confidentiality issues and can be published properly. And finally, the tension related to the scientific systems. Well, we all know, I mean, we need to value more in incentive schemes the collaborative and participatory practices. In general, in particular with transdisciplinary research, co-authorship is not particularly valued in social sciences, at least in Argentina. This is something that needs to be changed, and in particular, it needs to be changed, the idea of working and writing together with non-academic researchers. And also in the definition of institutional priorities, right? So we need to create new indicators that take into consideration the social impact of these science, society connections, right? But those indicators need to be in relation to the different missions that different universities may have. It doesn't, one good practice, it doesn't fit all the different organizations. So we need to define institutional priorities in terms of social environmental goals or impacts for each university. This would be the mission. And then we need to also develop some indicators that take into consideration those missions and assess researchers and researchers working in organization, also the organization itself, in terms of the priorities that have been defined in the first place. I think I can just stop here, and I'm happy to listen to questions.
Muito obrigada, Valéria. Eu acho que houve uma complementação bem interessante.
Thank you very much, Valeria. I believe there was a very interesting complementation with Professor Haklay's presentation, and I will continue the talk going back to the point where Valeria stopped. I try to do this briefly so we can have more opportunity to talk, especially with our colleagues and international guests. So I will start exactly mentioning on how the Cidadã agenda can be included in the policies to foster science and research in Brazil. What are the challenges? And I will focus especially in the issues of evaluation to fund projects regarding science in Brazil, considering that these policies may be to facilitate, but they can be hurdles to implement new agendas, not only citizen science, but innovations in general. As we say here, we have to form groups of allies. It's not possible to have any research or any type of project if we don't have allies to make this feasible in the whole realm of and the network of connections that make these projects feasible. So the starting point is exactly the last mention of Dr. Arza and Archimedes Melo, that was in the opening session on Monday as representative of CNPq, which is the institute funding, National Institute for the Promotion of Research in Brazil, that has to do with the innovation of institutions. And here, research institutions in particular, with a certain academic orthodoxy, where our scientific communities and our fostering agencies. So there is an issue related to culture, but also, I think, is an issue of learning how to incorporate other criteria to evaluate projects that are not those strict census criteria. And these criteria are being challenged previously to the movement for open science that are privileging the point of view of the so-called hard sciences, natural science or objective sciences. This is something Dr. Arza mentioned in the projects of citizen science, because they also prioritize statistic and simplistic data, which is data to evaluate the quality of scientific journals, and also because they are based on excellence criteria that are external to us, South, more defined by the global North. and criteria and agendas that are not necessarily the priority in our reality. And because they do not foster, to the contrary, they are an obstacle of a composition of multidisciplinary and even less transdisciplinary science. So the starting point are already problematic issues, even if it is not citizen science programs. There are different scenarios. Scientific promotion is more now in the agenda of the fostering agencies. The record of our curriculates that now have more visibility as of the COVID-19 pandemics, when they also become more concerned with the growth of thesis denying science and the use of this pseudoscience in political debates, not only here in Brazil, here it's something more recent. And with a bias of evangelizing for science and less for a perception of thinking science as a space for challenging, for doubt, for questions. I believe that there is this debate, and the promotion and communication of scientific research and other dialogic perspectives is very interesting. We also see a valuing of extensional activities of universities, both in their curriculum, evaluation, and progression in the career. So this is an important indicator. We see that good part, at least in Brazil, of citizen science projects are also part of extension activities, and a concern of fostering agencies of bringing and knowing and incorporating principles and of open science to the criteria, mechanisms, and policies for evaluation and fostering science. And then we have some issues to debate. Without exhausting all of the issues, we are in a moment of experimentation and hearing more than concluding. As I said in the opening session, it's time to go to the interstitia and see what are the controversies and conflicts. But how can we guarantee this necessary support to projects and initiatives in citizen science and somehow bring citizen science to mainstream of fostering science policies in order to guarantee sustainability and feasibility in time, the expansion and spreading in the territory, and in the same time avoid trends to shield the innovative character of these initiatives with a very restricted definitions of citizen science and with criteria that are not little flexible to new formats, agendas, and proposers for this type of project. I believe that this is a point of concern, and in the opening conference, this was one of the issues raised by Antonio Lafuente. So we are killing our cash cow here with innovation.
A gente vê também, e acho que as apresentações de hoje do Muki e da Valeria mostra que há.
We also see, and Muki and Valeria's presentation show that the need to adopt a definition that it's at the same time a broad definition of a citizen science that considers the ample fields of approaches and methodologies where it's inserted is then very much necessary. So the acknowledgement of participative methodologies, and at the same time to locate these characteristics, to identify local characteristics in different dimensions, and also specific questions. A study that we held on initiatives of citizen science to deal with COVID-19 in Brazil shows a variety of possibilities, of formats that we could somehow locate in this field of citizen science. In the first workshop of the Brazilian network of citizen science last year, there was a session on funding coordinated by Antônio Saraiva from the University of São Paulo, with the participation of a SEBRAE, the Brazilian service to support micro and small companies, Serra Pinheira Institute, a private foundation, Boticário Foundation, also a private foundation, and the Foundation to Foster Research in the State of São Paulo, FAPESP, one of the foundations that has more resources to invest. And some questions were then identified how to think projects that could deal with more flexibility to fund activities that are not necessarily those one that include strict scientific research, such as dissemination, training, and so on. How to document proponents without the appropriate titles or without institutional connections, but with good citizen science projects. Natalia, if you wish. So there is a potential ecosystem here that could cover different types of projects of citizen science, especially in the European context. We see a diversity of possibilities, different types of institutions that can offer support to these initiatives, from museums, environmental agencies. It's true that we have differences in our support systems here. We have a support system that is much more concentrated with less variety. And at the same time, as we saw in last year's panel, institutions, Serra Pinheira Institute is already participating, but Boticário and SEBRAE Foundation, they are not in the field of traditional institutions where researchers will go for funding. And we see that in Brazil, and in this slide, we see that the paper that we published in 2020, if I'm not mistaken, together with Ana Rocha, we see that we have projects that we call initiatives. Projects are the one with a determinate term, and initiatives are the ones that are a proposition. They are proposed for a long-term duration, sometimes continuous, with continuous duration, but sometimes end due to the drawing of the funding. But these projects developed by researchers connected to public teaching institutions, many of them in the area of graduation and not necessarily the area of research, and also initiatives with long-term duration, some of them promoted by non-government organizations or by association of volunteers, frequently in cooperation with universities and research centers, showing that not always these more formal spaces can host this kind of initiatives. The focus of these actions lie on social environmental agendas. I think this is almost a rule around the world, and there's a number of characteristics and attributes that are connected to citizen science that is explained to that, specifically characterization of fauna, birds, marine species, monitoring of ecosystems, quality of air and water, disease vectors, observation of the sky. We must highlight the Brazilian system of biodiversity information, the CBDR. It's a platform that tries to provide visibility to several initiatives and projects of citizen science on biodiversity, because that's exactly the initial focus of this first generation of citizen science projects in Brazil. Now we have CIBIT, but we're not going to go into that now. The next slide, please. Also, the monitoring that Luana Rocha carried out in her master's degree thesis from 2017 to 19, and then we have reviewed that in a more recent publication, showing that 2/3 of researchers that develop projects and 2/3 of the researchers that develop projects and or participate on publications of citizen science are located in the southeast of the country. So copying the concentration of scientific publication, and it's not like any part of the southeast, but rather São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, followed by the region south, midwest, north, and northeast. Most of them are higher education institutions, specifically public universities with concentration on biological science, especially botany, ecology, zoology, followed by hard sciences and sciences of the earth, science, computing science due to the infrastructure of the citizen science and its connection with computer science structures, and human science, especially sociology, geography, and education. On the other hand, we recognize that there is a universe of initiatives and projects involving research methodology, social cartography, production of information and knowledge, undertaken by activist movements and organizations that act on territory conflicts, hacker activism, hacker space, feminist movements, anti-racist movements that could be classified in this broadened field of citizen science. So an alert that, from my point of view, we must pay attention to is not to fall hostage of this possibility of different types of projects and initiatives under a very strict label of citizen science. So we should try to avoid this market reserve, the policies to fund these initiatives, and we should not use very strict definitions of the concept. And I agree with the statement that I took from the book by Smith and all, that will say that rather than figuring out how to scale up apparently innovative objects, policy might think about how to scale down its institutions, how to focus their institutions for further cultivating grassroots innovative capabilities, meaning that instead of simply thinking of scale up small things, making them big, based on certain political priorities, we should look at what's happening in the territory in terms of innovative things. And I usually give the example of the policy of points of culture promoted by our Minister of Culture, former Minister of Culture, Gilberto Gil, in the beginning of this century, trying to identify all innovative initiatives in the field. And I'm going to speak briefly about the ongoing work, as I said in the beginning of the presentation, of the work group that it's the mark number 5 of citizens science in the area of the Open Government Partnership, international initiative fighting for the transparency of the governance. Brazil was one of the founding countries. Today, this initiative has 77 participants, and its 4th action plan, 2018 to 2021, has embraced as one of the topics the area of open science. And now in its fifth plan that started last year, 2021, and goes to 2023, they have incorporated among their different commitments commitment for evaluation to advance open science in this perspective. One of the bottlenecks is exactly in the policies for fostering and evaluating projects. Among these 11 marks in this area of open science in OGP, we have mark number 5, which are indicators, which are a word that really scares me. I already challenged this topic. So indicators for citizen science. So we are in the middle of the work. Natalia, last slide, please. Where, based on a number of different considerations, especially in the grayish area of literature, of what the word is thinking about the parameters that are important criteria, what is in science. We listed here initially 8 sets of indicators that would apply to scientific research and citizen science. And our concern here is exactly to open the idea of science in strict sense, but the idea is research results from the idea of the right to research, which is one of the topics that we address in the project, resulting in other recent publications. So there are several actors that can be supported in their right to research. And a second set of indicators are about citizen engagement, and a third one, the benefits. So the criteria generate for benefits for participants, for non-scientist participants. What are these benefits? Ethical, legal aspects, social environmental implications, infrastructure, and the unfoldments after the conclusion of the support, the end of the project. What's the legacy left by these projects? Some of these cases, in one way or the other, were presented in our previous speeches. For each one of these sets, we thought of a number of criteria that we discussed in the workshop that we had yesterday. And we're going to take this debate further on August 30th to fostering agents. It will be a hybrid event. Partly will be face-to-face in Brasilia, so because we have CNPq, CAPES, and other institutions that foster scientific research. Not exactly to validate, but also to hear from different institutions, to collect suggestions and perceptions. We're not going to go into much detail, but this is a document that we are consolidating to be published very soon to the community. So with that, Natalia, thank you. We can stop sharing the screen. We have already some questions. Please, if I leave your question out, please let me know. But we have 2 questions from Blandini Viana, one of the founders of the Brazilian Network of Citizen Science from the Federal University of Bahia, to Professor Muki Haklay. 2 questions are, and I think I'm going to publish them in the chat. to help translators. Thank you. Well, maybe Muki has already translated them, but let's see. One of them, the process to insert citizen science in Europe. Is it based on demand organized by the engaged social actors and social actors engaged with citizen science, for example, universities, or by coordinators of different initiatives and practitioners, people that lead these initiatives? A second question that I'm going to ask, thinking of the relevance of adopting a clear definition of citizen science for the purpose of formulating policies and giving such a broad vision of citizen science that we are adopting, allowing the inclusion of a great diversity of initiatives, of integration of science and society, in your opinion, what is out of the scope of citizen science? So, Muki, you have the floor. Did you understand the questions?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much. So I'll start with the first question. I would say that it's a combination of, most importantly, people who are champions. So it's to find people in what's called in organizational studies champions, someone who take a cause and kind of work with it. And that can be both from the bottom up or from the up downward. And in these cases, there were all sorts of people who were interested. So within the Open Science unit of the DG Directorate General of the European Commission, which is the kind of equivalent to a ministry involved in research and development, there were several people with interest and commitment in citizen science, and they were reaching out to the community asking for help and opportunities. And we, of course, gladly provided them briefing and information. At the same time, people from within the community, such as Johannes Vogel, someone who's worth mentioning, the chair of EXA and the head of the Natural History Museum in Berlin, made connections, say, with the German government during the time when they had the presidency of the European Commission, and organized a conference on citizen science and the sustainable development goals, or, for example, reach out to the Open Science Policy Platform, which is the body for which the characteristics were created. I can say that something similar to that also operates at the different levels below that, with someone taking the initiative. So you see it also, for example, with the League of European Research University, or now with the organization around the libraries, where there are several people that are really committed to it, like Tiberius Ignant, who from a company called Know-How, something similar. There is also, for example, with the UNESCO recommendation, it's really important to highlight how within the Global Citizen Science Partnership, Uta Van was leading on the community of practice that kind of responding to the opportunities that were provided. So there are opportunities that are around, for example, opportunity for comments on the Open Science recommendation, but someone need to take them and do things with them. For me, for example, because I'm committed to the Ohus process, it's part of my research, I was aware that the recommendation on environmental information tool were coming along, and I was gathering people to help in influencing the policies there. So actually there is an opportunity for what we can call policy activism within, by working with different policies and bodies, but then at some point the wheel kind of turned to the other way. So once the regulations were there, the opportunity, for example, for the mutual learning exercise came because different research and innovation offices from across Europe were saying, oh, That's now on the agenda of the European Commission in Horizon Europe. We need to get our activities and our university in place. We want to know how to do that. Let's do an exercise and learn about the best practices. So that's, I hope, an answer about the dynamics of the first question. Can I remind it about the second question?
Pensando na relevância de adotarmos uma definição.
Thinking on the relevance of adopting a clear definition of citizen science with policy aims,
Yes.
with and for citizen science, with a broad view.
Yeah, so you notice at the beginning of my presentation, and I'm happy to share it, I shared the link to the brochure of the Commission. And if you look at the characteristics of citizen science, you'll see that we looked at the problematic areas. So we actually there is a whole underlying research below that about understanding where are the places where there can be a dispute about what is and what isn't citizen science, and trying to get into those areas. I'll give you some examples. The issue of volunteering is appearing in some definition of citizen science. But those of us who work with marginalized groups or with indigenous groups know that when you're working with people that are actually on subsistence living, if they want to participate, you need to figure out what their replacement income. They are still volunteering to contribute data and to participate in co-design and in other aspects that make it clearly a citizen science, because it's about the egalitarian knowledge production. But at the same time, this is not volunteering. Also, for example, another interesting case that it's relevant to a lot of people in this network will be that what happens when someone is involved in citizen science as a student in the university as part of their curriculum. Principally, they are not volunteering. Someone volunteered them to do something on the project. So the volunteering is kind of delicate issue and clearly need to be addressed in an appropriate way, and we address it in the characteristics. Another one really interesting is in the medical area. And there you can look at something that is a clinical trial when someone is just being experimented on. They are asked, say, to use a digital device and collect information about their practices, but they are not involved in the design of the process. They are actually being treated. When you check the process, you'll discover that they're being treated as a subject, not or as an object of the research. They are a data point. They are not participant in the process. So there, for example, in the medical research, and also Valeria talked so nicely about social science, we have exactly the same problem of something that in one version, same method, same approach, but actually a lot of time it's the mindset. And if it is about participating fully and allowing the participants to change the research and to have opportunity to change it, it can become citizen science. But if we are treating them just as data points that are providing us data, as in surveys or interviews, then it's not. So there won't be black and white answers, and that's I see as something very important, because citizen science, even after 20 years, is still a growing practice, and new areas are discovering it and wanting to join. And you want to enable people from the humanities or from other areas to say, hey, what I want to do is citizen science. So they should be able to have access to the funding and to the resources that we're offering, and then get education through joining networks on how to do it properly. And the commonalities that this fascinating transdisciplinary area is providing can spread to different areas of academy and practice.
Ok. Tem uma perguntinha para mim.
There is a question for me. What is the proposal for the application of indicators? Will they be used per project, per fostering agency, or what? So this was exactly the first point of discussion of our group. It was a group formed after the establishment of this framework and commitment. And the title is already difficult because it talks about indicators of citizen science, and this is very broad. This is quicksand because we are approaching a new issue, and indicators usually they give the idea of quantitative indicators. So in the first step, we had to clarify that we are talking about criteria that may have indicators to evaluate projects of citizen science, thinking on financing, thinking on fostering agencies, because this is the commitment, which is evaluation and transparency of science with the inputs of open science. And citizen science would be one of the frameworks for that. And everything is thought towards the financing, towards obtention of finances. So we decided to limit within this constraint, because if a project has to respond to all aspects, the 8 of major themes that we presented with their sub-aspect, there is no project of citizen science whatsoever that can cover all of that. So our concern is that this should be maybe demagogic, because when fostering agencies propose some points and criteria, then the projects also start to have a concern on that, but it cannot be shielded, it cannot be restricted, and it is we need the agencies to supply the necessary financing so we can cover some of the aspects. For instance, when we talk about open science and we need to open data, we need infrastructure for that. We need to have a data repository. We need learning to carry this out, time, staff to take care of that. So the policies, as they incorporate these dimensions, although they seem fair and just and equalitarian, they must be accompanied by the tools and infrastructure that make this feasible. So this is an area that we have to step baby steps, little by little, so we have a construction that opened this aspect. As the case of infrastructure, there is a major discussion in open science about open infrastructures. In the case of citizen science, it's even more delicate, because we are talking about citizen science based on digital infrastructure. If we have infrastructure that is highly concentrated, private, on the hands of major corporations, how citizen science can use the development of open structures? They need to be supported by open infrastructure. So there is an avenue for discussion here. Valeria, I would ask you to make a comment on how this dialogue with the things you are doing in Argentina and in your relationship with other groups.
Sorry, Sarita, I didn't get your question.
Eu convidaria você.
I invite you to elaborate on. We are about to close the session. If you want to comment based on what you heard in the presentations, and And what is the relationship of all of that with what you are developing in Argentina, if you want to make any comments?
Yes. Yeah, I think that the different measures that need to be taken into consideration when thinking about promoting open and citizen science need to be taken into consideration the different complementarities among the different practices that you need to promote, right? So that's something that I also found in Argentina related to applying. There is a very interesting law of promoting open access, but then there are not the necessarily technical support in terms of infrastructure, also in terms of skills and training the researchers to actually apply the kind of practices that are meant to be applied for addressing the law, for addressing the mandatory requirements regarding how they should deal with open science practices, mostly open access so far. But now we are thinking about recommendations related to open science and citizen science. And this is something that you cannot just think about recommendations in the vacuum. You need to think about the different interrelations, all the different aspects that need to be taken into consideration if you really want this to be put forward. So I think that there are all these, these synergies between the different practices that require certain measures that need to be considered thoroughly in order to promote this kind of practices when they are that different from what is actually being done in terms of traditional research and the traditional way of assessing research and funding research. So if you really want to make a switch and think about different ways of producing scientific knowledge, you need to consider all the different dimensions that are there. And I think that what you said is also very relevant for what we have in mind here in Argentina when we think about the recommendations to promote citizen science and open science. I mean, there is, for instance, just to start with, there is no national mapping on what kind of requirements people that actually try to create citizen science initiative, what are the challenges that they have faced, right? So first of all, you need to know what are in the particular context, but this is because all these are situated experiences. We cannot just draw from what it has done or has been done in Europe. We need to deliver our own recommendation based on our own conditions. And first of all, what you need to do for that is just to do, an inquiry in the research system, in the socio-technical system that affects citizen science initiatives to understand what is missing, first of all. And then after that, you need to try deliver some recommendations and some good practices that need to be consistent and articulated and integrated among themselves. Otherwise, it's very difficult for them to work.
Oops. Muchas gracias, Valeria. Muito obrigada.
Thank you, Valeria. Muki, we are about to finish. If you have some final words, final remarks.
No. It was interesting to hear the examples from Argentina and from Brazil. It's very valuable to see the development across the world. And I think that I would highlight again the groups that exist within the global partnership, such as the Open Science and Citizen Science, and encourage people to join them, because we do need to hear voices from across the world and kind of coordinate how we work with different funding agency and different research area, and kind of consider the issues in different areas. It was very clear in the UNESCO Open Science recommendation that the input from other countries, for example, about open access, was critical to understand the conditions and other aspects. And I would call for more collaboration between us on that.
Muito obrigada. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, with that, we will close this session. I once again would like to thank Professor Muki Haklay, which is also an English native English speaker, but Muki lives for a long while in London, so none of them. So we use English to communicate. So I thank Muki and Valeria for that and for the time they dedicated to that, and all of you that were here during lunchtime following us, I hope eating something. And let's continue this talk in next activities. We will inform you, especially on the scope of the government initiative for open science. I believe we will meet in Santo André, at least online. I believe we are in the same roundtable for policies. Well, thank you very much. And I would like also to thank the interpreters, both simultaneous interpretation and sign interpretation, to give accessibility. I can't fail to recognize this huge effort. Thank you very much. We thank as well.